This is a bonus episode of Away, a podcast for anyone interested in a secular approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. Hi, everybody. I feel actually a little funny calling it a bonus episode because it almost feels arrogant or something. I wrote a piece for AA Beyond Belief that was accepted and put onto the website today, which is exciting for me. And I don't know, I feel proud and I'm happy and it's kind of cool. And I've had some really nice comments and it feels good. I wanted to, in case you're not someone who reads or goes to websites, but you are someone who listens to this podcast and others, I just thought I'd take a minute and read the article. I am personally someone who learns best by listening and absorbs the most by listening, so this is just another way to read the piece that is now available on aabeyondbelief.org, with many thanks to John S., who runs that site and is just a phenomenal person. My experience, strength, and hope with AA. I first attended AA meetings in New York City in 2004. I was 26 years old and my life had become unbearable. I had just moved back from a year in Glasgow with high hopes for a fresh start at home. Glasgow hadn't been the fresh start I had hoped it would be. Did you know they drink there too? Of course, moving home wasn't the answer either, and within a couple of months, I found myself as miserable as I had been when I left for Scotland. I woke up on a Saturday morning, barely able to move and writhing in hangover. There's no language to describe those hangovers adequately. There was the physical pain and discomfort, aches from head to toe, a sticky, dry sweat seeping from every enlarged pore, hot flashes followed by complete numbness, nausea, and dizziness. And there was the emotional pain, shame, self-loathing, and then absolute misery. Years before, one of my many therapists had given me 2 books, Living Sober and The Power of Now. The doctor hadn't said much when he gave them to me, only suggested I read them. It won't come as a surprise, I'm sure, that I didn't. I just put them on my bookshelf and forgot about them. That morning, when my crusty eyelids unsealed themselves, the first thing my eyes landed on were those 2 books. My first thought, of course, was I just want to die. I can't feel this way again. But I didn't pray. I didn't make a wish. I made a decision. I pulled the copy of Living Sober from the bookshelf, and without even opening it, I knew I never had to feel that way again. I dialed 411 and asked for the number for AA, and I called Intergroup. The woman who answered the phone was kind, as I recall, and suggested I head over to a meeting that afternoon, less than a mile from my apartment. I would not be able to leave my house that day, not only because of how sick I felt, but because there was no amount of makeup that could cover it all up. So she suggested the same meeting at the same place, the 79th Street Workshop, but the next day. Sunday morning, feeling a little better, not much, I spent an inordinate amount of time getting dressed and applying makeup before the meeting. My anxiety was high. Not because the prospect of sobriety was daunting, I still wanted it, but because being in public was always distressing. Everyone who looked at me thought I was hideous. People thought I was a fat, disgusting slob. They whispered and laughed at me behind their hands. Or so I thought. Dressed up and psyched up, I headed uptown. All I remember is sitting near the back, raising my hand when they asked if there were any newcomers in the room, and tearfully saying, "I'm Stephanie and I'm an alcoholic." A woman seated in front of me turned and put her hand on my shoulder. The next day, I found another meeting, and another, and another. I made friends. I had a sponsor. I went to meetings. I didn't do the steps. The big book led me to believe that I needed to change everything about myself in order to get well. I took it literally. So I went from bleeding heart liberal to conservative within a matter of months. I told myself I wanted a conventional life. I said I wanted to get married and have children. I said that I thought traditional roles were ideal roles. I wanted to believe in God, so I pretended to. I went to church. I prayed. I set aside everything that I had ever believed in, really believed in, to stay sober. I willfully ignored my sponsor when she tried to disabuse me of some of my more zealous ideas about life and living. I went to meetings, I had the big book, and I had God. I'd be fine. I spent 4 years in the rooms, 4 years without a drink, 4 years with growing anger and intense discomfort with the person I had become. I ate away my new shame. I ate and ate and ate my way to 260 pounds. So I was fat and miserable, but at least I was sober. Leaving the house had become more difficult. The self-loathing was powerful. It had grown stronger and stronger, and neither group of drunks or capital G God were helping. I was an unmedicated, mentally ill person. The only medication that had ever worked was alcohol. So, after 4 years, when life seemed even more unbearable than it had when I was drinking, I drank again. The next 3 years were more or less a blur. No different, no better. I binged on food, booze, and coke. But at least I could socialize again. At least the fear of other people wasn't controlling me anymore. At least I could leave the house without tremors and nausea. At least, until none of that was enough. And again, I found myself unable to live that way anymore. I was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. I had no mirrors in my house because the shame was eating me up from the inside out. It was the end of a 2-day cocaine-fueled booze binge that I knew I had to stop. I lay on my bed, yet again writhing in hangover, yet again filled with shame and sadness. And my first thought, I could go to the top of my building and jump right now, is obviously not the choice I made. My second thought, call James and ask for help, was the choice I made. It was a choice I made because I had been a member of AA. Not only had a seed been planted, but I still knew a few people who were staying sober, albeit I wasn't in touch with them very frequently anymore. I called James. I said, I need help. And he came to help me. Eventually, after living for a few months on borrowed Antabuse and fear, I decided to try AA again. But this time I did it differently. I got a sponsor, I did what was asked of me, I listened, I read the big book, I did the steps, and this is really important, I did not set aside any of my real values or beliefs. My sponsor then was a spiritual woman, although she never disclosed to me her denomination. I'm fairly certain she isn't a theist. She asked me to find a higher power, and I did in a fashion. She never asked me to define it. It was never supernatural. I decided then that the power of truth was all I needed. The good within the human animal is, to me, inherent, not a miracle. I didn't then, nor do I now, think that anything brings about kindness and generosity other than ourselves. To honor my truest self is to be honest and kind with myself and others. Back in AA in New York City, my life was slowly but surely getting better. The second time around feels different, because it is. I wasn't trying to shed my old skin. Instead, I was trying to heal it. There are parts of this skin, this self, that were worth holding on to. There were things that were inherently good that needed to be enhanced, not erased. And the second time around, I got it. In part, it was the help of a solid sponsor. In other part, it was the meetings I attended. And it was me. Rather than turning it all over, I looked into myself and found the strength and courage and bravery that had always been there. With all those tools and many more, I forged ahead. It wasn't until I met my now husband, Richard, and moved from the city to the suburbs that my newfound love for AA began to diminish. For me, AA had been a foundation on which to build a new life, but for him, it had been life. His bottom was a lot lower than mine. The things he needed from AA were greater. His love for the big book was so real, it seemed to me it consumed him. At first, I felt jealous of his relationship to it. And it was that jealousy that brought me to his home group. The group was and remains huge. It's full of energy and enthusiasm. There are dozens of newcomers and as many old-timers at every meeting, 7 days a week. It's what you hope every newcomer walks into for his or her first meeting. Or so I thought. Immediately, I understood why he had such a deep affection for the program. His home group was so alive. It wasn't just a bridge back to life. It seemed like it gave you a life. My husband is an extrovert and derives energy from other people. Social gatherings are his lifeblood. That's not true for me. I can play the extroverted part so well that all but a few friends know that I'm actually an anxiety-ridden introvert. Or I was. I was that anxiety-ridden introvert when I first went to his home group. For him, it was oxygen. For me, it was carbon monoxide. He would leave the meeting filled with energy, and I would leave exhausted. About a year after moving, I found a new psychiatrist, something I would not have been able to do without the foundation of AA. I was sober, my life was average, moments of happiness, moments of sadness, moments of calm, moments of chaos. But I was still very uncomfortable. I'm not merely an addict. I have bipolar depression, social anxiety, accompanied by OCD and a panic disorder. There were moments fully immersed in AA that I was unable to leave the house because I was so consumed by anxiety. Unfounded panic stole entire days from me, and AA hadn't yet, and was never going to be, the solution, nor was a supernatural higher power. So I sought the help of a psychiatrist, and unmiraculously, he cured me with Zoloft and Lamictal. Now that the fog of fear had fully cleared with the help of the right medications, I was able to see my husband's home group more clearly. I completely understood what he saw in it and what he got from it. I also understood that he was better able to set aside certain distasteful aspects than I. I continued attending the meeting with him for a long time, and while it wasn't exactly my cup of tea, it was fine. I sponsored a few women, all of whom are still sober, a couple of whom still attend that group. Election cycles came and went, and right before my eyes, the group went from overly enthusiastic to overly zealous, from impassioned to ideological. I no longer heard higher power and only ever heard God. The emphasis was no longer on one alcoholic talking to another, but instead on how God could and would if he were sought. When one particularly zealous young woman spoke, I was appalled when she described the big book as a love letter from God. A few weeks later, another member said during his qualification that those who did not believe in God were doomed to drink again. Thanks for the death sentence, pal. I began to notice, too, that every meeting was being closed with the Lord's Prayer, a particularly Christian prayer. When I made mention of it at a business meeting, the unlearned argument of "it's tradition" won. I was very disturbed by the trajectory of the group and the unwillingness of its members to even entertain being more secular in their approach. I used the only tool I had left, my voice. I would not say any prayer at any point during the meeting, nor would I join in the other chants, and I didn't apologize by bowing my head, but held my head high. A young man with 2 years said to me after one meeting, "You know you're not doing anything by refusing to say the prayer." I responded that if one newcomer in that room was terrified by all the discussions of God and saw me and decided to come again, then I most certainly had done something. He scoffed. I walked away. I stopped going to this group as often. When I did, I made an effort in my shares to remind the group that a higher power and God are not synonymous, and that of your understanding does not imply an embrace of the supernatural. I tried, of course, to be more diplomatic. On occasion, I would clearly state that I am an atheist and that AA worked very well for me, even with that horrifying shortcoming. It was when a member suggested at a business meeting that the word atheist be banned from use at the meeting and that atheists should not be allowed to share that I was done. His motion was voted on and did not pass, but because he felt comfortable making the suggestion and the group took it seriously enough to take a vote, I never went back. I attended AA meetings in the beginning to help myself. When I was healthier in mind and body, I kept going to help others and myself. God or not, AA meetings were a great way to remind me why I chose to get sober. I have come to understand shame as my great motivator, my higher power, if you like. I don't roll around in shame and self-pity, but I won't let myself forget it either. Meetings help me remember what it is to feel ashamed, because as long as I remember it, I won't want to feel it again. I'm not kind because God will reward me later, and I don't do good deeds for the recognition, although of course I like it. Well, I don't tell the truth because otherwise I'll go to hell. I don't stay sober for the bragging rights. I'm kind because it feels good, and hopefully it makes someone else feel good too. When I'm mean, I'm riddled with guilt. I tell the truth because it is so much easier, and lying kind of makes me feel dirty. I stay sober so I don't sleep with a guy I met at a bar at 4 a.m. or end up at a friend's house for days calling into work sick so I can keep doing lines, or end up coming out of a blackout covered in bruises, cancel plans with my sister on Christmas Day because I'm too hungover to move, or miss the baptism of my friend's first baby because I'm leaving the bar at the same time the service begins. To do those things makes me sick with shame. And I stay sober in big part so I never feel that way again. For me, shame leads to self-loathing. This group, as it turns out, is similar to too many groups. The scourge of religiosity and ideologues with bullhorns has drowned out the primary purpose of AA, to stay sober and help other alcoholics achieve sobriety.